Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the 2021 CNAS Annual Conference. I'm Richard Fontaine, Chief Executive Officer of CNAS, and I'm very pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, the 35th Deputy Secretary of Defense. And there she is. Prior to becoming Deputy Secretary, Dr. Hicks held the position of Senior Vice President, the Henry Kissinger Chair, and the Director of the International Security Program at CSIS. And from 2009 to 2013, she served as a senior civilian official in the Department of Defense. She was Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Deputy Undersecretary of Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and led the development of the 2012 Defense Strategy Guidance and 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. So, Dr. Hicks, we're delighted to have you with us today for the annual conference. Thank you and welcome.
Great. Thank you, Richard. It's really nice to be with you, and I wish I could see you in person. This is, I know, the 15th annual CNAS National Conference, and I remember attending the very first of your conferences and seeing so many colleagues and friends. So I hope next year you'll be able to return to an in-person format. So just over a week ago, President Biden released his fiscal year 2022 budget request. What I thought I'd do today is just take a few minutes to lay out our approach to defense and how it manifests in this first administration defense budget, and then turn myself over to Richard's interrogation. So just as this conference is focused on looking forward to meet the national security landscape, so is our budget. The $715 billion defense request is aligned to the President's interim national security strategic guidance, and it is further guided by Secretary Austin's message to the force, which lays out 3 priority areas for the department: defend the nation, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork. Broadly, this request takes a clear-eyed approach to Beijing and provides the investments to prioritize China as our pacing military challenge. The PRC is increasingly competitive, and it has the ability uniquely to challenge the international system and American interests within it. Immediately, however, defending the nation means defeating COVID-19. We make investments that reestablish DoD's important role in pandemic preparedness and health force protection. Defending the nation also means addressing the damaging effects of climate change. In doing so, the budget request invests in energy-saving platforms, resilient installations, and more efficient and diverse power sources. Our strategy and budget address advanced and persistent threats emanating from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other transnational and non-state actors as well. In advancing American interests, the department must be ready to not only serve in a supporting role to our diplomatic and economic tools, which is most frequently what we are doing, but to also deter military aggression. This is especially true with regard to the PRC. The FY 2022 request provides the resources necessary to ensure the DoD maintains that credible deterrent by sustaining readiness and protecting investments in critical capabilities. The budget also documents some of the tough choices we had to make. We lessen our reliance on vulnerable systems, but simultaneously reallocate resources to fund research and development in enabling technologies like cyber, AI, and quantum. In fact, this budget includes the largest research, development, test, and evaluation request ever at $112 billion, which includes $14.7 billion for science and technology. We make investments in long-range fires and seek to make advancements in hypersonic systems, including defensive systems. More than this, the budget also strives to ensure that the department is working with all those across the nation who have a role in our national security. That means focusing investment in American manufacturing and innovation, especially in underrepresented populations and with small businesses. Critically, our request includes different efforts related to microelectronics, including making investments in domestic design and production. And the President's request also ensures that we continue to take care for the total force. We prioritize growing our talent by providing pay raises for both military and civilian personnel. And we seek to make investments in the workforce where the department has critical demands like cyber. The FY22 request also looks to build an increasingly resilient force, one that recognizes and embraces its diversity as a strength. We also make investments in the military health system, and provide $8.6 billion for military family support programs. In ensuring accountable leadership in the department, the budget supports sexual assault and harassment prevention. And the budget provides funding to strengthen DoD's ability to identify and address insider threats and extremism in the ranks. With those highlights in mind, I want to turn back to Richard, and I look forward to our discussion.
All right, thank you. That's a great overview, and much appreciated. Let me start, actually, I guess, with a pretty basic question. The 2018 National Defense Strategy listed long-term competition with China and Russia as the department's principal priorities, called for increased investment in those efforts, and then put efforts to deter North Korea and Iran and defeat terrorists at a lower level of priority. We can infer some from what you just said in terms of the budget priorities, but is that how the current department sees the strategic priorities? And how does the budget link to the forthcoming NDS, which of course is, sure, I guess, in the works?
So let me pick up where you left off in the question. We have a National Defense Strategy Review underway now. It's required by Congress every 4 years, so we're right on cycle for that. So there'll be a 2022 National Defense Strategy that updates the 2018 strategy, which updates the 2014 strategy, which updates actually the 2012 and the 2010, and go backwards as much as you like. There are threads of continuity through all those strategies, and I think it's fair to say that the way in which we are directed now under the president's already released interim national security strategic guidance and in the secretary's message to the force, both of which I referenced, those documents both point very squarely to China as our pacing challenge. So that piece, I think, is one of continuity that we go into this NDS review cycle with a sense about. I've mentioned some of the other areas that are a little different than the 2018 NDS. Obviously, we are very focused on climate challenges as example. Climate change is a challenge. We are looking at China a little more distinctly than Russia than I think was true back in 2018. Look, the world changes a lot in 4 years. And we are going to take an updated, fresh look at everything we do. But we have some pretty strong signaling already out there in terms of what the president has said and what the secretary has said. And by the time we have our new strategy next year, I'm sure there'll be much more that's a little bit unique and different.
Great. And Secretary Austin has said that the cornerstone of U.S. defense is integrated deterrence, and has spelled out a bit about that. What does it mean exactly, do you think, and are there budget lines that support that new approach, or there are areas in the budget that you would say that is linked to this new approach, integrated deterrence?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of continuity of themes here. I wouldn't frame it quite maybe the way your question was framed. So I think I would say it this way. The Secretary is trying to draw a strong recognition to what we say in other places and other ways around the connectivity that we have to bring to military, you could call it DIME, military, economic, diplomatic, and other approaches that we need to take. We have to have an integrated approach in that sense to national security. And that's a very long-standing theme. Within the Defense Department and in the security space specifically, we also have to be really integrated in how we think about challenges that emerge from space, cyberspace, the nuclear realm, all the way through conventional and subconventional. Again, that's a pretty common theme that we have been focused on in the defense community. And then if you layer into that the reality that the way in which an adversary may challenge the United States moves up and down any given set of spectrums, I would use that in plural, thinking through how those tools have to be applied and how we have to operate through multiple domains, it gives you this sense of the many seams that exist in how the United States currently integrates its approach to deterrence. And it's those very seams that adversaries like China, Russia, and others are aiming at. And those aims, by the way, also are international. So integrated deterrence is also trying to speak to this idea that we are stronger when we work with our allies. So when you ask about the 22 defense budget and its relationship to integrated deterrence, what I would say is what we have laid down in this first budget, a lot of the streams that feed into this idea that will be more fully fleshed through the National Defense Strategy process of how we bring those threads together as a Defense Department. My comments here today speak to several of those areas in terms of defense being one of a number of national security tools, and trying to think imaginatively and anew about what it takes to deter a determined adversary in the current era.
So there's not a budget line that says integrated deterrence X dollars. It arises from these various efforts that are listed.
No, I don't think there was a containment budget line. No,
Right,
I think
right.
the point is not to have a budget line that says integrated deterrence. That would be sub-optimizing to the concept.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. You mentioned climate change, and both the president and the secretary have listed this as a major national security challenge. And what is the impact that you're seeing of climate change on the U.S. military? Does it go beyond hurricanes damaging naval installations and needing to spend money to rebuild those and things like that? And what really is the department's role in countering climate change?
Sure. The way in which we are affected by climate change is both in terms of our ability to operate, so effects on our readiness. You can think about that as training days lost. You can think about that as installations damaged, ruined. In one case, of course, in the case of Tyndall, completely wiped off the map, if you will, in terms of our ability to use it. Runway damage, et cetera. So you can kind of start from that bottom up piece of how do we become resilient, just as we have to be resilient to cyber threats. How do we become resilient in the face of a changing climate? And so there's a whole basket of activities there. But I would start, based on your question, on the much broader piece of this, which is how the changing climate affects the mission space for DoD. So there are some areas that are already very evident. The Arctic is one where we have a competition for resources and advantage happening in the Arctic. That's a whole new geographic area for the United States military to be understanding how it supports everything from science research that is going on up there, search and rescue, and general navigation and ability to maintain freedom of the seas for commercial interests, and of course to prevent it from being militarized, which we're already seeing in the case of Russia, a good amount of militarization there. If you switch over to other parts of the world that are especially affected by sea level rises, you could think in particular in Asia, but also, of course, closer to home in the Caribbean. There's significant likely effects on our partners and allies. You look at the Marshall Islands, which is expected to be entirely underwater by 2050, and we have to be thinking about our own ability to respond if required to and asked to in humanitarian and other areas. And then you can also turn to areas of the world where governance is already a significant challenge and look at how climate is affecting and creating potential missions for the Defense Department out of climate effects. Closest to home, the Northern Triangle is probably quite obvious in terms of the climate effects, which are part of the formula that's driving economic insecurity and driving folks up to the southwest border. Guess who gets called on to help support at the southwest border? It's the United States military. And in addition to that, you can think of much more concerning where migration flows through Africa and through the Middle East, for example, might actually lead with that poor governance to instability that can lead to conflict and create requirements for the U.S. military. So those are some of the ways. It's a pretty extensive look at climate, and frankly, it's longstanding. The national security community first pointed to climate as a challenge in a very bipartisan way in 2008. It was the former Senator John Warner, Republican, who had made a requirement for the Quadrennial Defense Review when we had those to include an assessment of climate for the Defense Department. And we're really just getting back to regular order to understanding in a facts-based way the ways in which the military is affected by climate.
Got it. And maybe I can move over to and pick up on something you mentioned in your opening remarks, is this high-level RDT budget, which is pretty striking, suggesting big investments in modernization and capability development. You've talked before about the iron triangle of painful trade-offs among trying to balance readiness and capability and capacity. So how do you see this budget tackling that iron triangle, making some of these painful trade-offs?
Yeah. So first of all, kudos to you for a thorough understanding of my prior work. So I have talked quite a bit about the challenge that it's not um, something to be easily grappled with in terms of the DoD budget. There's usually a lot of talk about top line around the DoD budget should grow, it should lessen. The reality is there are some immutable pieces that have to be balanced. And so what we've tried to do with this first budget is do exactly that, walk through the balancing, making sure we are managing our force structure in terms of, you can think of that as end strength, but also structure growth. You can look at places like the Marine Corps where they're doing fundamental force redesign as they're thinking about what are the force structure of elements of the future. So part of it there is making sure we're designing for the future and that we're managing through the control of the personnel and strength. If you look at readiness, we've tried to sustain readiness. There's been an uptick, an improvement in readiness over the last several years. I would say there, one of the biggest things I would point to, of course, is the president's decision to withdraw U.S. forces out of Afghanistan before the beginning of fiscal year 2022. So our budget accounts for over the horizon requirements. It creates some space there as we determine what that will look like. But it also creates space in terms of understanding that the requirements on the force coming out of the Middle East will come down, and thinking through how we reprioritize and ensure that we have readiness for the right approaches for the future. And then on modernization, as you point to, we have a significant investment in RDT&E. We do still have a significant investment in procurement. And we're going to work really closely with Congress to try to help us do this transition into the future in a way that is practical, that ensures we have buy-in and creates jobs in the United States.
Let me ask you a question about technologies. It's actually related to the RDT&E question. You know, the department's quite obviously putting a huge emphasis on acquiring cutting-edge technologies, including as a distinguishing edge between the U.S. military and its potential adversaries. There's been a lot of good efforts over the recent years, DIU and Project Maven, et cetera, but one still hears about the valley of death between prototyping a particular capability and actually seeing it become a program of record. Is that still an issue? And what do you think that the answer to it is, if it is?
It is definitely still an issue, and it's one that we're very focused on trying to advance against. I would say the prior administration, Undersecretary Ellen Lord in particular, should be lauded for her efforts in this area. There are some efforts that she began that we are continuing forward and trying to accelerate. Those include things like alternative pathways on acquisition. So you can think of software pathways, other approaches that don't require one to go through the full milestoning process, and trying to use those approaches to jumpstart projects all the way through to production and scaling. But that's not going to be the only solution. We have a challenge in terms of the PPBE process, the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process here in the building. And then, of course, on Capitol Hill in terms of the 2-year appropriations process, really helping in particular small companies that don't have enough capital up front to survive all of that process to try to get something on contract for procurement. So we're working closely with Congress to try to see if we can shrink down that time scale and come up with creative solutions. For example, what you use to define what's a new start, if you can constrain that a little bit, you can have more opportunities to upgrade. Again, think software more than hardware, and then apply it back to hardware solutions. So approaches like that. And then the last thing I will say is, I'm very focused on how you get experiments underway that are linked very well to our concept process, so that we have a really strong iterative approach, and then that we have thought all the way in advance about transition pathways and buying in the services, for example. Usually it's a service will be the component that has to transition a capability. So how do we buy them in early and literally buy them in terms of support that we can give from the levers that the Secretary and I have. So those are parts of our answer. And I think what I would just conclude with is it's not going to be one thing that solves the valley of death. It's a number of contributing factors that make it so hard to work with DoD.
Yeah, and this linking up of the PPB&E process with where Congress is, it's got to be done, but it's no easy task, right? So let me, you mentioned Afghanistan and the over-the-horizon capability that I believe the department wants to maintain so as to continue to be able to conduct at least counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan after the withdrawal. What's the sort of status of how that will work? I know there's discussions going on with neighboring countries and so forth. And from a budget standpoint, is the notion that the costs associated with an over-the-horizon capability conducting operations in Afghanistan would be a lot less than conducting operations in Afghanistan from Afghanistan?
Well, we're working through all of that right now. We are the secretary and the chairman and the CENTCOM commander, among others, are looking at exactly what that idealized capability is. And then, as you point out, we have to take into account regional aspects and allied approaches. And so we will have, over the course of this summer, proposals to give to the president in terms of what that over-the-horizon capability should be. I think what I would say is, Richard, is that you had it just right. It's for counterterrorism. It's not an over-the-horizon capability to do all things, to operate as the United States was operating in Afghanistan, but outside of it. It is rather to take the approach we do in most parts of the world with regard to counterterrorism, which is to ensure that we have sufficient strategic warning and ability to prevent threats from coming and reaching Americans here at home. And so that's the guiding star for how we'll be thinking about that capability. We'll also, by the way, have a separate over-the-horizon capability for providing assistance support that we do to the Afghan National Security Forces.
And with our remaining 8 minutes or so, let me ask you a couple of questions about some of the people who, after all, make up the Department of Defense. One of the things that I know is high on your agenda and the Secretary's agenda is to look at retention, in particular for women and minorities, and also the distinction between minority representation at the lower levels and at the senior officer ranks in the military. So how are you approaching that set of questions?
Sure. So one of the first things we did coming in after I was confirmed is look at the governance processes of the Pentagon and the Defense Department. And there's a curious hole in them that, as best I can tell, has always been there, which is we have a lot of senior governance approaches that we use for budgeting, that we use for, you can think of acquisition programs that go through the DAB. We have a requirements process through our JROC. And then for personnel issues, people issues, human capital, talent management, whatever you want to think of those baskets as, we had nothing. So that's a problem when you have a rhetoric across, again, decades of saying people are number one priority, to not put the same effort and attention at a senior level and not require the same accountability of senior leaders, to rather stovepipe it over into that's the chief human capital officer's problem, or that's the one's problem, for those who speak, command structures. So we changed that, and we've created a Deputies Workforce Council. It feeds up through me. It has some 3-star bodies underneath it that help. Depending on the issue, it might go through a different 3-star process, but ultimately it comes up to me with the vice chairman, and we work through any number of issues, to include the ones you've just mentioned. So on specific issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, let me just first say there's a massive business case for DEI. There's a lot of talk right now about DEI, but the talk doesn't seem to be about the requirements the department has over the next 20 years to attract and retain the finest fighting force in the world, and to have a civilian. We have a total force. We have a major employer as civilians as well, and contractors. And we need that base of support to be technically savvy. We need to access the best minds in America. We need to have great creative ideas. Agility of thought is always at the top of the minds for military leaders when you ask them what kind of leaders they need in the future. And to access all that talent, we need to access the whole pool of the United States among those who are fit, eligible, and ready to serve, whether in civilian or military capacity. So the first thing we have to do is set that standard. What is that workforce vision of the future? And we're working through that right now. The second thing is, what does the data tell us? And getting transparency around data is a massive challenge for DoD in every sector, but in DEI, it's a great example where show us the data. We should be able to pull that data and see what are those promotion rates? Where are we having knees in the curve? And we are seeing some of that based on the data we have now. I think we can get better data. But as you point out, Richard, in your question, we definitely have a challenge at the senior ranks, civilian and military, attracting and retaining folks to those ranks. So we're thinking now through all kinds of challenges, all kinds of approaches related to the types of skill sets and MOSs, if you will, that are most important to have at the senior levels. We're looking at the way in which we conduct promotion processes, civilian and military. And the secretary is very interested in making sure he has a personal connection with the service, the military department secretaries, the service chiefs, and the chairman, that we all are in a conversation together around how we get after this problem. There's been a lot of good positive momentum built. Again, actually, in the last administration, there was a DEI effort that began in the summer of last year. And there's a lot that we can take from that and build on going forward.
Great. And the secretary, when he came in, launched a 60-day stand down to initiate conversations on extremism. Obviously, worries about extremism in the ranks before, but especially after January 6th and all of that. And those conversations, I gather, took place with every service member, and they weren't a data collection exercise, but I would guess there would be some lessons that arose from those conversations, maybe about the scope of the problem, what to do about it. What sense did you kind of pull away from that 60-day exercise on extremism?
Absolutely. So just as you said, there were lessons learned, and they each component had developed out of the process a memo. And we also had a sit-down conversation. The secretary and I and those component heads had a conversation around what they learned throughout their efforts. I think the number one takeaway universally was that the most meaningful conversations and exchanges were at the human level. They were small group. They were about people learning about personal experiences from one another. They were about empathy and connection. And in retrospect, perhaps that sounds really obvious, but oftentimes what we do in training, whether it's the Department of Defense or elsewhere, is we, especially in an era of COVID, we're creating a very distanced and rote training approach. And what we found is the degree to which people could connect to one another more directly and start to have conversations around how to know when someone is, having trouble at work, when they might be susceptible. Because one of the things we know is that groups that exhibit extremist behavior, white supremacist groups and others, target particularly our military personnel and veterans, because they can be attractive sales, for them to be able to say, well, we have these active duty military members, or to actually get some of the capability and knowledge that they have. So a lot of it can be around how you strengthen and become more resilient as a unit, whether that's a unit in the field or a unit sitting in an office at the Pentagon, to understand when people are looking like they're having trouble. And of course, also we had a lot of conversation on the accessions process and how to make sure we bring people into our total force that are ready to stand up to the oath of office that they take, and focus on that oath, which is at the base of everything else, unites us all, whether you're civilian, military, whatever service you're in. If you're here at the Department of Defense, you are raising your right hand to that oath to the Constitution, and that's what we have to keep coming back to.
Okay, last question. The president's going to spend the week in Europe talking to allies. Obviously, the administration's made a huge change in tone with respect to allies in Europe and in other places. The number one question I've heard over the past month or so from our European friends is, what does the United States want from its allies now? So I'm going to ask you that question.
Well, the United States, first and foremost, wants its allies to come together on a common security vision. So that means we have to come with a values-based approach, which is to say that democracies have an interest in protecting themselves in an environment where autocracy is on the rise. And then I'll just say on the defense piece of that, to make sure that we're developing together the kinds of capabilities that, as I indicated before, make a meaningful difference in terms of deterrence in a modern sense. The way in which adversaries or potential adversaries, competitors might try to come at the United States or its allies often comes below the threshold of military conflict. And that's not a place where we lead. But what we want to do is make sure we have the capabilities necessary to keep conflict minimized and down at that level, and that we're always putting forward a strong deterrent so that those autocracies do not think that we lack the will or capability to protect ourselves.
Great. Well, thank you, Deputy Secretary Hicks, for taking the time to join us today and for sharing your thoughts with us. Very valuable to all of us. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of the viewers for tuning into this. In just a second, we're going to actually move directly to our next session, which is called Show Me the Crypto. As we say thank you and farewell to Deputy Secretary Hicks, I will now turn it over to our Senior Adjunct Fellow in our Energy Economics and Security Program, Yaya Fanu.